Story number 1, Approval Chain. I was assigned to coordinate the inter-facility transfer of a juvenile detainee from a downstate holding center to a secure youth facility in the Adirondacks. It was standard procedure for overflow cases during the winter intake surge. We handled these transfers regularly, particularly in January when the system was at capacity. The paperwork had come through the previous afternoon, and I had confirmed the transport schedule with both facilities before my shift began at 7 in the morning. The transport manifest listed the detainee as male, age 15, no medical flags, no behavioral alerts. The estimated arrival time was 9:30. I had the holding room prepared and the intake documentation queued in the system. When the van arrived at our processing dock at 9:27, I went down to meet the driver and the escort officer. The driver was someone I had worked with before, a contractor who ran the route twice weekly. He stepped out and opened the rear doors while I held the clipboard. The escort officer climbed into the passenger compartment and then stopped. He looked at me and said the compartment was empty. I asked him to check again. He did. The driver insisted he had never stopped, that the route had been continuous, that the doors had remained sealed since departure. I reviewed the van's GPS log on the driver's tablet. The route was unbroken. Departure timestamp matched the manifest. No stops, no deviations. I asked the driver to wait and went back inside to call the downstate supervisor. While I was on hold, I pulled up the security footage from the departure facility. The video was clear. At 6:51 in the morning, 2 officers escorted a juvenile detainee in standard transport coveralls to the van. He was placed in the passenger compartment. The doors were sealed. The van departed at 6:54. I watched the footage twice. There was no ambiguity. The downstate supervisor came on the line, and I explained the situation. She said she would pull her own logs and call me back. I returned to the processing dock. The driver and escort officer were standing by the van, neither of them speaking. I told them to remain on site until we had clarification. I went back upstairs to my office and began drafting an incident report. Halfway through the second paragraph, one of our intake officers knocked on my door and told me the detainee was in holding room 3. I followed her down the hall. The detainee was seated on the bench along the far wall, hands folded in his lap, wearing the same transport coveralls I had seen in the departure footage. I asked the intake officer who had processed him. She said no one. She had been passing the room and saw him through the window. I checked the entrance checkpoint log. There was no entry recorded for any detainee in the past 2 hours. I asked her to wait outside, and I entered the holding room. I attempted to follow standard intake protocol. I identified myself and explained that I needed to verify his information. He did not respond. He did not look at me. He sat motionless, staring at the floor. I repeated the question. No response. I moved closer and asked him to confirm his name. Nothing. His hands remained folded. His breathing was shallow but steady. I stepped back and observed him for a moment, then left the room and returned to the monitoring station. On monitor 4, the holding room appeared empty. On monitor 7, which covered the same room from a different angle, the detainee was visible on the bench. I switched between camera feeds. 3 of the 5 monitors showed an empty room. 2 showed the detainee exactly where I had left him. I called the maintenance line and reported a possible camera malfunction. The technician said he would send someone when available. I went back to the holding room. The detainee was still there. I returned to my office and retrieved the biometric scanner we used for intake verification. I brought it to the holding room and knelt in front of the detainee. I explained that I needed to scan his fingerprints. He did not react. I took his right hand. It was cool but not cold. I pressed his fingers to the scanner surface one at a time. The scanner cycled through its sequence and then displayed an error message I had never seen before. UBJET, EADs, DAD, Finedispic EOZD. I ran the scan again. Same message. I tried his left hand. Same message. I contacted my supervisor and explained what had occurred. She told me to isolate the holding room and wait for a specialized transfer team. I asked how long that would take. She said they were already en route and would arrive before end of shift. I returned to the holding room and engaged the magnetic seal on the door, then returned to the monitoring station. On monitor 7, the detainee was still on the bench. I began drafting an updated incident report. Approximately 20 minutes later, I glanced at the monitors. All 5 feeds showed an empty holding room. I went downstairs immediately. The door's magnetic seal was still engaged. The access log showed no entries since I had locked it. I opened the door. The room was empty. The specialized transfer team arrived at 3:40 in the afternoon. There were 2 of them, both wearing unmarked uniforms with facility credentials I did not recognize. They reviewed my report in silence, asked no questions, and requested access to the security server. I provided my login, and they spent 90 minutes reviewing footage. When they finished, they disconnected the external drive they had brought and told me the footage had been transferred for analysis. They reclassified the entire transfer as a clerical error with no detainee ever assigned. I asked about the departure footage. They said it had been reviewed and was no longer relevant. They instructed me to complete my shift rotation as normal and submit no further documentation regarding the incident. I was instructed to delete my draft incident reports. I complied. The transport van was released, and the driver was cleared to return to his normal schedule. The downstate facility was notified that the transfer had been cancelled due to administrative error. I finished my shift and went home. 3 weeks later, I received notification of reassignment to a regional office processing only administrative appeals. The transfer was described as routine workforce rebalancing. I reported to the new location the following Monday. My access to the Facility Transfer Coordination System was revoked. I have had no further involvement with juvenile transport logistics. The incident was removed from all official records. I was told the archive classification is permanent. Story number: Timber Access. I was assigned to enforce the seasonal closure of a restricted logging zone in Olympic National Forest during late autumn. The patrol was routine work, the kind we handle every year once the weather turns and the access roads become liability risks. My job was to verify the perimeter gate, check for unauthorized equipment, and confirm that no personnel or contractors had remained on site after the official closure date 3 weeks prior. I arrived at the gate just after 8 in the morning. The chain was intact, the lock undamaged, but I noticed tire tracks in the soft ground leading past the gate into the restricted zone. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud from recent rain. I walked the fence line and found no breach, no sign of forced entry. The tracks simply began on the interior side of the gate, as though the vehicle had materialized there. I radioed dispatch and requested confirmation that no maintenance crews or federal personnel had been granted access. The response came back within 5 minutes. No permits issued, no scheduled entries, no exceptions logged. The zone was fully restricted. I unlocked the gate and drove in, following the tire tracks along the access road. The forest was dense on both sides, old-growth cedar and Douglas fir that had been marked for limited harvest before the restriction was imposed. The road surface was uneven, rutted from years of heavy equipment, and the tracks I followed were consistent with a commercial logging truck, wide, set duals and significant weight distribution. Approximately 2 miles in, I reached an abandoned staging area that had been used during the previous season. The logging truck was parked there, angled across the clearing with its bed empty. The engine was cold when I touched the hood. The cab was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, no paperwork in the glove box, no identification or company markings anywhere on the vehicle. I documented the VIN and ran it through the database on my mobile unit. The registration came back to a contractor that had ceased operations 4 years earlier. I conducted a perimeter search of the staging area and found a cleared path leading deeper into the restricted section. It was not an old skid trail. The ground had been disturbed recently, and the trees on either side had been felled within the past 72 hours based on the color of the sap and the lack of oxidation on the cut surfaces. The path was approximately 12 feet wide and extended beyond my line of sight into the forest. I followed it on foot, marking my route with flagging tape at regular intervals. The path continued for nearly half a mile, straight and deliberate, with no deviation. The trees that had been cut were uniform in size, all between 18 and 24 inches in diameter, all felled with clean cuts consistent with a chainsaw or mechanical harvester. The path ended at a secondary clearing that did not appear on any of the survey maps I carried. 17 trees had been cut and arranged in concentric circles, all pointing inward toward a central depression in the ground. The depression was roughly circular, approximately 8 feet in diameter, and filled with dark water that did not reflect the sky. The arranged trees were still green, their branches intact, and they had been positioned with care, each one aligned precisely with the next. I attempted to radio dispatch and received no response. My handheld unit showed full signal strength, but every transmission went unanswered. I checked my vehicle GPS on the mobile unit and found that it displayed my location as unchanged, still showing me at the staging area despite the distance I had traveled. My handheld compass spun without settling, the needle rotating slowly in complete circles. I took photographs of the clearing, the arranged trees, and the central depression. I documented the scene as thoroughly as possible, then withdrew along the flagged path back to the staging area. My radio function returned once I cleared the secondary clearing, and I was able to reach dispatch without difficulty. I returned to the logging truck and reviewed the photographs on my camera. Each frame showed only uncut forest, the clearing, the arranged trees, the depression. None of it appeared in the images. The metadata confirmed the correct time and location, but the content of the photographs did not match what I had observed and documented. I secured the staging area, locked the perimeter gate, and returned to the district office. I filed an incident report citing possible illegal logging activity, unauthorized vehicle access, and evidence of recent timber removal within a restricted zone. I included the VIN of the abandoned truck, the coordinates of the secondary clearing, and a request for follow-up investigation. I was contacted within 6 hours by a federal liaison whose name and agency affiliation were not provided. The conversation was brief. I was instructed to reclassify the report as administrative closure verification with no findings. The liaison confirmed that the restricted zone would be extended for another season, and that no further action was required on my part. When I asked about the logging truck and the cleared path, I was told that the vehicle had been removed and that no evidence of recent activity had been found during a follow-up inspection. My patrol logs for that date were removed from the regional database the following week. I was reassigned to coastal enforcement duties effective immediately, a lateral transfer with no change in grade or pay. The restricted zone remains closed, and I have not been assigned to that section of the forest since. The incident was archived as resolved with no additional documentation required. Story number 3, Prescription Trail. I arrived at the rural clinic pharmacy in central Montana on a Thursday afternoon in late September to conduct a routine quarterly compliance inspection of controlled substance inventory and dispensing records. The drive had taken just under 3 hours from Helena, most of it on 2-lane highway through open rangeland. The clinic itself occupied a converted residential building on the eastern edge of a town with a population of roughly 400. I parked in the gravel lot and went inside at 2:15 in the afternoon. The pharmacist, a woman in her mid-50s who had operated the clinic for 17 years, met me at the counter. She provided her license without prompting and unlocked the dispensing area. She appeared cooperative, but mentioned that several prescription records from the previous month were difficult to account for due to what she called a filing error. I asked her to clarify. She said some papers had been misfiled between August and September, and that she was still working to sort them. I made a note and began the physical inventory. The controlled substance cabinet was a standard commercial unit, properly secured. I worked through the scheduled 2 medications first, logging each bottle against the perpetual inventory ledger she maintained. Everything matched until I reached the hydrocodone section. During the physical inventory count, I noted that 4 bottles of hydrocodone were present on the shelf, but had no corresponding dispensing logs, purchase orders, or DA forms in any system dating back 6 months. I checked her computer records. I checked the paper files. I went back through the previous 2 quarters of documentation. There was no record of these bottles entering the inventory. When I asked the pharmacist to explain the discrepancy, she stated that the bottles had always been there. I asked her to clarify what she meant. She said she did not know when they had arrived, but that they had been on that shelf for as long as she could remember. I pointed out that the inventory system she was required to maintain would necessarily include a record of their acquisition. She became visibly distressed when I pressed for documentation, repeating that she did not order them and did not know how they arrived. Her hands were shaking. She asked if we could move on to the rest of the inspection. I told her I needed to examine the bottles more closely. She stepped back from the cabinet, but did not say anything further. I opened one bottle to verify the NDC number and lot code. The label appeared standard, with a lot number and expiration date printed clearly. But the tablets inside had no imprint, no scoring, and no identifiable markings of any kind, which violates every manufacturing standard for controlled substances. I have conducted these inspections for 9 years. I have never seen a commercially produced controlled medication without an imprint. I asked her where these had come from. She did not answer. I asked if she had noticed the tablets had no markings. She said she had never opened the bottles. I asked why not, given that dispensing requires verification. She said she had never dispensed from them. I asked why they were in the active inventory if they were not being dispensed. She did not answer. The pharmacist began insisting I leave the bottles alone and not file a report, claiming that they take care of themselves. I asked her what that meant. She said that previous inspectors had signed off without issue, and that there was no reason to create a problem where none existed. I checked my tablet for prior inspection reports. The last 3 quarterly inspections had been conducted by 2 different agents, both of whom had noted no discrepancies. I asked her directly if she had shown them these bottles. She said she had not hidden anything. I told her I was required to secure the bottles as evidence pending further review. She asked me not to. I asked if she was refusing to cooperate with a federal compliance inspection. She stepped away from the counter and said nothing else. I secured the 4 bottles as evidence and completed the remainder of the inspection without further incident. I photographed the cabinet, logged the chain of custody, and sealed the bottles in an evidence bag. Before I left, I asked her again if there was anything she wanted to tell me about the bottles. She said I should not have taken them. I asked why. She did not answer. I contacted my district supervisor from the parking lot at 3:50 in the afternoon. I explained the situation and sent photographs of the tablets. He told me to hold while he consulted the database. When he returned, he instructed me to dispose of them through standard hazardous pharmaceutical channels and close the inspection without escalation. I asked if he wanted me to file a full discrepancy report. He said no. I asked if the pharmacist would face administrative action. He said the situation did not warrant it, and that I should process the disposal and move on to my next assignment. I transported the evidence bag to the regional disposal facility in Billings the following afternoon. I signed the transfer documentation and handed the bag to the intake coordinator, who logged it into their system while I waited. The coordinator provided me with a receipt. I filed my inspection report that evening and marked the case closed. 2 days later, I received a follow-up call from my supervisor informing me that the disposal facility had no record of receiving the bottles, despite my documented chain of custody transfer. I told him I had the receipt. He said the facility had no corresponding entry in their tracking system and no physical record of the material. I offered to send a copy of the receipt. He said that would not be necessary, and that the case file had been administratively sealed. I asked on what grounds. He said the closure had been handled at the regional level, and that I would not be required to take any further action. The pharmacist submitted early retirement paperwork the following week. I learned this from a colleague who processed licensing updates. The clinic was quietly absorbed into a larger regional health network under a compliance restructuring initiative. No public announcement was made. The building was repurposed as a satellite office for general practice. I checked the directory. No pharmacy services are listed at that location. I was reassigned to administrative review duties in Helena and instructed not to conduct field inspections in that county for the remainder of the fiscal year. My supervisor described the reassignment as a temporary adjustment to staffing needs. I have not returned to the area. The case file is no longer accessible through the standard database. When I attempted to retrieve it for quarterly reporting purposes, I was informed that it had been archived under restricted access protocol.